Victor Moretti had crushed his rivals for 20 years. Ruthless, wealthy, untouchable. But there was one weakness that kept him humble. He was paralyzed from the waist down. No walking, no standing tall, no running from the past. Stillness was the price he paid for his survival. That afternoon, he sat rigid in his wheelchair as his new nanny, Elara, adjusted the blankets around his legs. She was efficient, silent, invisible, just the way he preferred, until she froze. Her eyes locked onto a small, discolored bump near his lower spine. She leaned closer, her hands trembling. Then she touched a spot he was told was dead nerve tissue. With a sudden, decisive motion, she reached for a pair of tweezers and pulled out something thin, something metallic, something no surgeon had ever reported. Victor gasped. A shock of fire flooded his legs. And then, for the first time in 5 years, he felt something. The cold air, the fabric, the pain, the numbness shattering. And in that moment, the most dangerous man in the city realized the greatest miracle of his life had just come from the one person he hadn't bothered to look at. Stay with me until the end, because what he discovers about that object will change everything he believes about the accident that put him in that chair. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video. Hit subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get started. Victor Moretti watched the black SUV pull away through the reinforced glass of his study. From his seated angle, he could only see the roof of the car disappearing down the long, winding driveway. If he could stand, he would have seen the face of the traitor inside. If he could walk, he would have been down there on the gravel, ending the negotiation with a bullet instead of a polite dismissal. But Victor Moretti didn't walk. He rolled. The rubber tires of his custom-built wheelchair hummed against the Italian marble, a soft, mocking sound that had replaced the heavy, rhythmic footsteps that once made grown men tremble. He was the undisputed king of the city's underworld, yet he was trapped in a golden cage, dependent on ramps, elevators, and the pity of lesser men. His legendary rage was now confined to the white-knuckled grip of his hands on the leather armrests. He could order a hit on a senator from this room, but he couldn't chase a thief if they ran out the door. The paralysis was a leash, and every day, it felt a little tighter. The heavy oak doors creaked open, not for a lieutenant or a business partner, but for Agnes Holloway. The chief housekeeper moved with the silent, suffocating authority of a prison warden. She didn't knock, she simply flowed into the space, her silver hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull the skin of her face taut. She carried a silver tray with his midday medication, a ritual Victor loathed more than the injury itself. "Marco is still at the gate," Victor growled, his voice a low rumble that hadn't lost its edge. "Tell him I forgot something. Bring him back." Agnes didn't even pause. She set the tray down on the mahogany desk with a decisive clink that sounded like a judge's gavel. "Lieutenant Marco has been sent away, sir. It is time for your rest. You know what the doctors said about your blood pressure." She was the gatekeeper. Since the explosion 5 years ago, the car bomb that had turned the city's apex predator into a patient, Agnes had constructed a fortress of solitude around him. She claimed it was for his protection, to keep the stress from killing him, but Victor felt the walls closing in. She filtered his calls. She vetted his visitors. She was the one who decided when the king held court, and when he took a nap. "The accident took your legs, Victor, don't let it take your sanity," she said, her voice dripping with a cloying, toxic sympathy. She smoothed the dark blanket over his knees, a gesture that felt less like care and more like a jailer checking the locks. To the outside world, the narrative was set in stone. The explosion hadn't just broken his spine, it had broken his reign. They whispered that Moretti was finished, a relic gathering dust in a mansion he could no longer patrol. And as Victor stared at the legs that refused to obey him, suppressing the urge to sweep the tray off the desk, he hated the terrified realization that she might be right. Elara Monroe entered the Moretti estate the way one enters a mausoleum, quietly, respectfully, and with the distinct feeling that she was being watched by the dead. Her uniform was starched stiff, the black fabric absorbing the dim light of the hallway, rendering her nearly invisible against the dark mahogany paneling. She had been hired to be a ghost, a pair of hands to fold laundry and polish silver, keeping to the periphery of a life that had violently stopped 5 years ago. She found him in the library, a cavernous room that smelled of old paper and stagnant anger. Victor Moretti sat in the center, a dark island in a sea of Persian rugs. He wasn't working. He was staring at the unlit fireplace with a focus so intense it felt like he was trying to ignite the logs with his mind. Elara held her breath, clutching a stack of fresh linens against her chest. She had heard the whispers in the city, that the Lion of the East Side had been declawed, but the man in the chair didn't look weak. He looked compressed, like a coiled spring welded shut. As she moved to the far corner to tidy a side table, she watched him through the reflection of a glass cabinet. Victor shifted his weight. It was a microscopic adjustment, a sudden tensing of his shoulders as he leaned back against the leather seat. Elara paused, her hand hovering over a coaster. She narrowed her eyes. The briefing Agnes had given her was explicit: complete spinal severance. Total loss of sensation below the L2 vertebrae. A man with a dead spine doesn't wince when his lower back presses against a cushion. He doesn't grit his teeth in a reflexive reaction to contact. That was a pain response, sharp and immediate. Victor shifted again, a sharp intake of breath flaring his nostrils as his back made contact with the chair's lumbar support. It wasn't the dull ache of a sore muscle. It was the flinch of a raw nerve being touched. "Is the view to your liking, Miss Monroe?" The voice didn't come from the chair. It came from the shadows near the door. Elara spun around to find Agnes Holloway standing there, her eyes cold and hard as flint. The housekeeper crossed the room in 3 long strides, moving with a predatory silence that betrayed her age. She positioned herself physically between Elara and the master, severing the line of sight. I thought he was in pain," Elara whispered, gripping the linens tighter until her knuckles turned white. "Mr. Moretti feels nothing from the waist down. That is his tragedy," Agnes hissed, her voice low and venomous. She stepped closer, invading Elara's personal space until the smell of antiseptic and lavender water filled the air. "You are here to maintain the household, not to diagnose the head of this family. Do not stare at him like a zoo animal. Know your place, girl, or you will find yourself on the street before the hour is up." The opportunity arrived 2 days later, born from a moment of humiliation. It was late afternoon, and the house was strangely quiet. Agnes had been called away to the front gate to deal with a delivery dispute, leaving the library unguarded for the first time in weeks. Victor was attempting to pour himself a glass of water from the carafe on his desk. His grip, usually ironclad, faltered, a spasm in his forearm, a tremor of the nerves he couldn't control. The heavy crystal pitcher slipped, shattering against the edge of the desk and drenching his lap and the wheelchair cushion in ice water. Victor roared in frustration, a sound of pure, impotent rage that echoed off the bookshelves. He slammed his fist into the wet mess, ignoring the shards of glass. Elara was there before the echo died. She didn't ask for permission, she simply moved. "Don't move, sir, there's glass," she said, her voice calm but urgent. She dropped to her knees beside the chair, her hands moving deftly to sweep away the larger jagged pieces before grabbing a thick towel from the side cart. "Leave it!" Victor snarled, staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched so hard a muscle feathered in his cheek. "Get Agnes. Agnes is outside, and you're soaking wet. You'll get a sore," Elara replied, ignoring the menace in his tone. In the world of paralysis, moisture was an enemy as dangerous as a bullet. Skin breakdown could kill. She didn't wait for his dismissal. She leaned in, carefully lifting the heavy wool blanket to dry the waistband of his trousers and the shirt clinging to his lower back. Victor stiffened, his hand shooting out to grab her wrist. His grip was bruising. I said leave it. I'm almost done, Elara said, not pulling away. She held his gaze, her eyes clear and unshrinking. Slowly, Victor released her, exhaling a breath that sounded like a growl of defeat. He leaned forward, resting his forehead in his hand, allowing her access to his lower back. Elara worked quickly, drying the skin. The shirt had ridden up, exposing the scarring from the surgery 5 years ago. It was an ugly, jagged map of pink and white tissue near his lumbar spine. As she dabbed the area gently, her thumb grazed a raised nodule right at the center of the scar tissue. Victor hissed through his teeth, his body jerking violently. Don't touch the nerve! Elara froze. She hadn't touched a nerve, she had barely brushed the skin. But her thumb was still resting on the lump. It didn't feel like keloid tissue. Scar tissue was rubbery, tough. This was hard. Rigid. Unyielding. She frowned, pressing slightly harder. The object didn't compress. It shifted, sliding just a fraction under the skin, independent of the muscle. Get out, Victor commanded, his voice trembling with the aftershocks of pain. Elara didn't move. She leaned closer, her heart hammering against her ribs, knowing she was crossing a line from which she could never return. She looked up at the terrifying profile of the city's most dangerous man. It's not a scar, sir, she whispered, the realization making her voice shake. It's metal. Get away from him! Agnes Holloway's shriek shattered the stillness of the library. She stood in the doorway, chest heaving, her face a mask of absolute terror. It wasn't the concern of a caregiver. It was the panic of a guard whose prisoner was being handed a key. I am calling security immediately. You are finished in this house. She reached for the wall intercom, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the panic button. Stop. The command was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of a gavel strike. Victor didn't turn to face his housekeeper. His eyes were locked on Elara's face. For 5 years, he had seen only pity or fear in the eyes of his staff. In Elara's eyes, he saw only terrifying certainty. She wasn't guessing. She had found something. Victor raised a single hand, palm out, signaling Agnes to freeze. The gesture was absolute. Agnes lowered her hand slowly, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but she didn't dare speak. The room fell into a suffocating silence, broken only by the ragged sound of Victor's breathing. Do it, Victor rasped, bracing his hands against the armrests until the leather creaked. Elara didn't hesitate. She reached for the small silver tweezers in the first aid kit she had opened to dress the potential sore. Her hands, which had been trembling only moments before, were now steady with surgical precision. She pressed the cold metal against the inflamed skin near his lumbar spine, finding the tip of the protrusion that had masqueraded as scar tissue for half a decade. She pinched the skin back and clamped down on the hard, white edge. Victor groaned, a low, guttural sound of agony that vibrated through his chest. It felt wrong, deeply, invasively wrong, like a tooth being pulled from a raw nerve. Hold still, Elara whispered. She pulled. The skin tented, stretching tight, and then gave way. There was a wet, sucking sound, followed by the slide of something long and rigid moving against the grain of his flesh. It didn't come out easily. It had been anchored there, calcified by time and the body's failed attempts to reject it. With one final, steady tug, the object broke free. Elara gasped, dropping the instrument onto the metal tray. It wasn't a piece of shrapnel. It was a needle, 3 inches of surgical steel, dark with old blood, thin as a wire. Before the metal even hit the tray, Victor's body violently rejected the years of stillness. A shockwave of pure electricity arced down his spine, bypassing the silence, screaming into the void of his lower body. His right leg, dead to the world since the explosion, lashed out in a violent, uncontrollable spasm, the heel of his shoe slamming hard against the floorboards. Thud. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Agnes covered her mouth, stifling a scream. Victor stared at his own foot, his chest heaving, as the fire in his nerves began to burn. Victor gasped, his hands clamping down on his thighs with a force that would have bruised anyone else. For 5 years, his legs had been nothing more than dead weight, foreign objects attached to his torso that he had to drag through life. Now they were on fire. The sensation wasn't the gentle return of feeling, it was a violent assault. It started as a prickling heat in his toes, then surged up his calves like molten lead, exploding into his hips with an agony so intense it stole the breath from his lungs. It was the screaming protest of nerves that had been asleep for half a decade suddenly jolted awake. "It burns," Victor choked out, his voice raw. He squeezed his quadriceps, his fingers digging into the muscle. He could feel the fabric of his trousers. He could feel the pressure of his own grip. "That means the pathway is open," Elara said, her voice trembling slightly but gaining strength. She was still kneeling, her eyes wide as she watched the involuntary twitching of his muscles. "The nerves weren't severed, sir. They were compressed." Victor looked up, sweat beading on his forehead, his eyes wild with a mixture of torture and ecstasy. "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything but remove the block," Elara whispered. She pointed to the tray where the bloody sliver of metal lay. "That object, it was positioned perfectly between the L2 and L3 vertebrae. It was wedged directly against the cauda equina nerve root." She looked at him, and for the first time, the submissive Nanny mask slipped, revealing a sharp, analytical mind underneath. "That wasn't shrapnel from the bomb, Mr. Moretti. Shrapnel is jagged. It tears. This was smooth. It was placed there." Victor followed her gaze to the tray. The object was terrifyingly small, a slender, 3-inch rod of high-grade surgical steel. It wasn't a jagged piece of a car chassis. It was a medical instrument, a needle modified to act as a permanent brake on his nervous system. "It was a kill switch," Elara said, the realization landing heavy in the silent room. "Whoever treated you, they didn't fix your spine. They turned it off." Victor reached out, his hand shaking, and picked up the needle. It was cold against his skin. He rolled it between his thumb and forefinger, staring at the blood that still coated the tip. It was clean work. Professional. The work of a surgeon who knew exactly where to press to make a powerful man helpless without killing him. The physical pain in his legs was blinding, but the rage blooming in his chest was colder than ice. The explosion hadn't paralyzed him. His own doctor had. The name triggered a memory, sharp and jagged as glass. Dr. Eris. Victor remembered the somber expression on the chief medical officer's face 5 years ago. He remembered the X-rays pinned to the light board, the grim shaking of heads, the definitive diagnosis delivered with practiced sorrow. "The spinal cord is severed, Mr. Moretti. You will never walk again." It was a lie. A calculated, expensive surgical lie. Victor stared at the bloody needle in his hand, and the euphoria of feeling his toes wiggle died instantly, suffocated by a cold, suffocating rage. The joy of recovery was replaced by the horror of the theft. They hadn't just taken his legs, they had taken 5 years of his life. They had turned him into an invalid, forcing him to watch his empire crumble from the sidelines while they patted his shoulder and fed him sedatives. He looked up, his eyes locking onto the empty air where Dr. Eris usually stood during his weekly checkups. The betrayal wasn't just business, it was biological. "Sir?" Elara asked softly, her hand still hovering near his knee. "Can you move them?" Victor didn't answer. He closed his eyes, inhaling deeply through his nose. He focused on the agony radiating from his lumbar spine. He welcomed it. The pain was truth. The pain was fuel. His mind, usually clouded by the frustration of his confinement, sharpened into a diamond-hard point. If Eris had done this, Eris wasn't working alone. A doctor doesn't cripple a don unless a capo pays for the malpractice. He opened his eyes. The vulnerability was gone. The shock had evaporated, leaving behind only the predator that had been dormant since the explosion. "Agnes," Victor said. His voice was no longer a growl, it was a flat line. The housekeeper flinched. "Sir, I didn't know. I swear on my mother's grave, I thought it was medical. I thought—" "Silence," Victor cut her off. He turned his gaze to Elara. "And you? You found what an entire medical team was paid to miss." He gritted his teeth, sweat dripping from his temple as another spasm seized his calf. He wanted to stand. Every fiber of his being screamed to stand up, to run, to kick down the doors of his enemies. But Victor Moretti was a strategist before he was a killer. If he stood up now, he was just a man with shaky legs. If he stayed seated, he was a trap waiting to be sprung. He pointed to the wheelchair that had drifted a few feet away during the chaos. "Help me up," Victor commanded, his voice steel. "Sir, you should try to stand the blood flow," Elara began. "No," Victor hissed. He grabbed the armrest, his knuckles white. "Put me back in the chair. Cover my legs with a blanket. Make it look exactly as it did 10 minutes ago." Elara hesitated, then nodded, understanding the play. Together, she and a trembling Agnes hoisted him back onto the leather seat. Victor arranged his legs with his hands, feigning the dead weight he no longer possessed. He pulled the dark wool blanket up to his waist, concealing the tremors of his reawakening muscles. "Tell no one," he whispered, staring at the door. "Call Dr. Eris. Tell him I'm having an emergency. Tell him I'm dying. I want him here within the hour." The grandfather clock in the corner of the study marked the seconds with a heavy, rhythmic thud of a heartbeat, each tick amplifying the suffocating tension in the room. Victor Moretti sat slumped in his wheelchair, his chin resting on his chest, a sheen of sweat glistening on his forehead. It wasn't entirely an act. The fire in his legs was a constant, throbbing agony as his nerves rewired themselves in real time. But to the outside observer, he looked like a man whose body was finally giving up the ghost. Elara stood in the shadows near the velvet drapes, her hands clasped behind her back. She was a statue, her face void of expression, though her eyes tracked every shadow. Beside the tea service, Agnes was vibrating with terror, the china cups rattling softly in their saucers every time she shifted her weight. "Steady," Victor murmured, not lifting his head. "If you drop a cup, Agnes, I will have you removed." The double doors swung open before she could apologize. Dr. Eris entered first, clutching his medical bag like a shield. He wore the practiced expression of professional concern, but his pace was brisk, eager. Behind him strolled Salva, the rival capo who controlled the docks, a man who had been keeping the peace, while Victor rotted in his chair. Salva didn't look concerned. He looked like an heir arriving for the reading of a will. He wore a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes, checking his gold watch as if he had a dinner reservation he didn't want to miss. "Victor," Dr. Eris said, his voice smooth as oil. He rushed to the side of the wheelchair, setting his bag on the desk. "Agnes said it was a seizure? A total collapse? I told you the degeneration would accelerate if you didn't rest." "It hurts, doctor," Victor rasped, playing the part. He gripped the armrest, his knuckles white, channeling his rage into the performance. "My back, it feels like it's on fire." Salva chuckled darkly, walking over to the liquor cabinet and pouring himself a drink without asking. "That's the burden of the crown, Vic. Heavy lies the head, right? Or in your case, the spine." He took a sip of the amber liquid, turning to face the room. He didn't even acknowledge Elara or Agnes. To him, they were furniture. He looked at Victor with a gaze that was almost pitying, but mostly triumphant. "Maybe it's time we talk about a transition, Victor. For your health. You can't run a city from a hospital bed." Dr. Eris pulled a stethoscope from his ears, placing a cold hand on Victor's shoulder. "Salva is right. Your vitals are erratic. The paralysis is likely ascending. We need to sedate you immediately to prevent further damage. Victor looked up through his lashes, seeing the glint of the syringe Eris was already preparing. They weren't here to help. They were here to finish the job the needle had started. Sedate me? Victor asked, his voice barely a whisper. Will that stop the burning? It will stop everything, Eris promised, tapping the syringe. You won't feel a thing. From her corner, Elara locked eyes with Victor. She didn't blink. The trap was set. The bait had been taken. Dr. Eris tapped the side of the syringe, pushing a tiny bead of clear liquid to the needle's tip. The room was suffocatingly quiet, save for the hum of the air conditioning and the rattle of Agnes's breath in her throat. I'm afraid the necrosis is spreading faster than anticipated, Eris said, his voice smooth, professional, and entirely hollow. He took a step toward the wheelchair, his shadow falling over Victor's slumped form. Your legs are deteriorating further, Victor. The muscle death is releasing toxins into your blood. If I don't administer this sedative to stabilize your heart, the shock alone could kill you. Salva, leaning against the desk, swirled his scotch with a lazy, predatory grin. Do it, document. Be humane. It's hard to watch a lion rot. Victor stared at the floor. He watched the polished tips of the doctor's shoes inch closer. He felt the cold anticipation of the men who thought they were burying him. The pain in his legs was no longer a fire, it was a forge. It was welding his resolve back together, bone by bone. Slowly, Victor lifted his head. The cloud of agony that had obscured his eyes moments before was gone. In its place was a look of terrifying, absolute clarity. Are they? Victor asked. The question was soft, but it hit the room like a physical blow. Dr. Eris paused, the needle hovering inches from Victor's arm. He frowned, his medical mask slipping. I beg your pardon? Are they deteriorating? Victor repeated. This time, his voice didn't waver. It dropped an octave, resonating with the dark, heavy timbre that had once commanded armies. Or are they remembering? Before Eris could process the change, Victor's hands clamped onto the leather armrests. The material groaned under the sudden, crushing pressure of his grip. The veins in his forearms bulged against his dress shirt. Victor, wait, your heart! Eris stammered, stepping back. Victor didn't wait. He pushed. The wool blanket covering his laps slid to the floor in a heap. Beneath it, the legs that had been pronounced dead for 5 years tensed. The quadriceps fired, visible even through the fabric of his trousers. With a guttural roar of effort that tore through the polite silence of the study, Victor Moretti uncoiled. Salva's glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the hardwood, but the sound was swallowed by the sheer magnitude of the moment. Victor rose. He didn't just stand, he expanded. From the seated position, he had been an invalid. Standing, he was a titan. He rose to his full height of 6'3", a dark monolith unfolding from the chair. The perspective of the room shifted instantly. Dr. Eris, who had been looking down at him for half a decade, was suddenly forced to crane his neck upward. Victor swayed once, his equilibrium adjusting to the altitude, and then locked his knees. He loomed over the doctor, his shadow stretching across the floor to swallow the smaller man whole. The syringe fell from Eris's numb fingers, rolling harmlessly away. The doctor's face drained of color, his eyes wide, reflecting the primal terror of a man realizing he is locked in a cage with a beast he thought he had declawed. Agnes had fled, the tea cart rattling in her wake, leaving the library in a stillness that felt entirely different from the oppression of the last 5 years. It was no longer the silence of a tomb, it was the silence of a battlefield after the victory. Victor stood alone in the center of the room. The adrenaline that had fueled his rise was ebbing, replaced by a dull, throbbing ache in his lumbar spine, a reminder of the needle, but also a promise of life. He took a breath, expanding his chest fully, standing tall enough to feel the air currents from the ceiling vents he hadn't felt since the accident. He turned toward the north wall. There, framed by heavy velvet curtains, was the arched floor-to-ceiling window. For 5 years, it had been his torment. From the wheelchair, he could only see the tops of the trees and the gray expanse of the sky. The city below, the city he owned, had been invisible to him, a kingdom ruled by memory. He had spent 1,000 afternoons staring at that pane of glass, hating the height of the sill that blocked his view. Victor took a step. Then another. His gait was stiff, his muscles trembling with the shock of sudden use, but he did not falter. He walked across the Persian rug, the sound of his dress shoes on the hardwood echoing like a reclamation. He reached the glass and placed a hand against the cold pane. He looked down. There were the lights of the harbor, the stream of traffic on the highway, the glittering grid of the empire that had almost been stolen from him. He was no longer looking up at the world, he was looking down on it. The reflection in the glass caught his eye. Not his own, but the woman standing behind him. Elara hadn't moved. She stood near the empty wheelchair, her hands clasped in front of her uniform, waiting. She wasn't trembling like Agnes. She wasn't cowering like the doctor. She was simply watching, bearing witness to the resurrection she had engineered. Victor turned slowly, resting his back against the window frame. He studied her, the quiet intelligence in her eyes, the steady hands that had defied a direct order to save his life. In a world of wolves he had found the one person who simply wanted to heal the wound. "They looked at me and saw a cripple," Victor said, his voice low and steady. "They saw an opportunity." He pushed himself off the window ledge, standing under his own power, no longer needing the support. "You saw what they didn't," he continued, taking a step toward her. "You saw the man." Elara met his gaze, holding it with the same quiet strength she had shown when she held the tweezers. Victor nodded, a silent seal on a new alliance. "You don't work for Agnes anymore, Elara. You work for me."